So let's say that you're trying to drive somewhere with your spouse and you're having to navigate together to get to somewhere that you want to go. Now, you can imagine that it'd help a whole lot to be on the same page in terms of how you define directions, right? I mean, things like what's north and south, left, right, on ramps, off ramps, that kind of thing. You see, knowing the terms and using them in the same way will help to orient yourself a lot better in conflicts, especially when those conflicts can start to feel layered and confusing. Having common language will help you to talk with your spouse about how to navigate your conflicts, and which will ultimately help you to correct your conflicts when things get messy or out of hand. Now, in these next couple of chapters, I'm going to start giving you that common language so that you can communicate better with your spouse in conflict. But as we go through these new terms, I want you to also keep in mind that we're essentially trying to define three key positions for any conflict that you might have. These positions will help you to know what kind of communication or conflict that you're having with your spouse and how to best prepare for that engagement. If either of you are off or aren't positioned appropriately in any of these three areas, you're likely going to cause a lot more mess and confusion in your conflicts that could easily be avoided. So let me give you an overview of those three key positions right now. The first position to determine is to define who the initiator of a fight or who the responder of the fight is. Now, maybe you can think of that like defining who's going to be the driver in the conflict and who's going to be in the passenger seat. The second position is defining the level of depth and intensity for the conflict. And you can think of that like trying to anticipate the amount of traffic or how hazardous the conditions are for the roads that you'll be driving on. Then the third and last position is the kind of conversation that you'll be using for that conflict. Think of that like defining which lane or route that you'll be using on the highway, understanding that different lanes on the highway are used for different things and are meant to achieve different goals. Now, as we go through this course on conflict, I want to start challenging you to be constantly thinking about how to define these three key positions. In a sense, it's like I'm challenging you to always be mindful of your surroundings so that you always be prepared to act and respond well when a conflict does come up. Doing this will help you to get to resolution a whole lot easier with your spouse and to help you to avoid unnecessary and painful fights. But I also want you to understand that it's going to take time and practice to make being aware of these three key positions more of a second nature thing for you. Remember, part one was like learning the basic skills of just how to use your car in the safety of a parking lot, how to use your pedals, how to check your mirrors, that sort of thing. You still need all those skills as we move here into part two, where we start putting you on the highway to learn the structure and to navigate those conflicts better. You'll have to practice using it enough times to where doing all these things at once becomes more second nature for you and to where you won't have to be putting nearly as much thought and effort into it. Okay, the first position that we're going to define here is the pitcher and the catcher. The pitcher is the speaker and the catcher is the listener and responder in conflict. Now, before I get into this, I feel like I need to offer a disclaimer. For pretty much this entire course, I've been using a car and traffic metaphor, and now I'm switching to a baseball metaphor. So trust me, I'm not intentionally trying to confuse you here, but I made an exception because a baseball metaphor just fits a whole lot better. The reason being is because in baseball, a pitcher's job isn't just to deliver the pitch. Their job is to deliver the pitch in a very specific area and in a very specific way for the catcher to have the highest chance of actually receiving it. And the catcher's job isn't just to catch the pitch, it's to make adjustments and to learn how to anticipate the pitch so that it can catch when the pressure of a game is on or the pressure of a conflict is on in our scenario. So this metaphor works just a whole lot better for explaining basic speaker and listener skills than any metaphor that I could come up with using car and traffic. So having said that, immediately this should shift the way that we think about communicating during a conflict. You see, the objective that a pitcher and catcher shares is connection, not being the other person or winning. In fact, they're actually on the same team, trying to work with one another. They're looking to make sure that that ball gets from the hands of the pitcher and into the hands of the catcher. The pitcher isn't trying to hit the catcher with the ball, and the catcher isn't trying to avoid the pitch or take over by becoming the pitcher themselves. The goal is to connect and to understand. Now, let me bring this back full circle and say that the key here is to define who the pitcher is in a conflict and who the catcher is. A conflict doesn't work if you have two pitchers pitching at one another at once without anyone actually trying to catch. So one of the things that you constantly have to know and define in a fight is who is functioning as the pitcher or the one with the issue, and who is functioning as the catcher and the one tasked to listen and understand. If you can't tell in the middle of a fight who's pitching and who's catching, you're likely going to find yourself in a pretty messy conflict that's destined for a lot of flooding. But beyond just identifying who the pitcher and catcher is in the fight, I want to go a little bit deeper into what makes for a good pitch and a good catch. So the good news here is that we've already kind of defined what bad pitching and catching looks like. Those bad fighting habits that we covered in Chapter 2 define all the ways that people can pitch and catch poorly. Things like spewing, stuffing, leaking, being defensive, and blaming, those kinds of things. In this chapter, we're going to define what good pitching and catching looks like. So to do that, we'll start with pitching. A good pitch has to have 4 key characteristics. It needs to be concise, it's got to be precise, it has to be introspective, and it needs to be vulnerable. Now let me explain each of those things for you so that we know what we're shooting for here exactly. A concise pitch means the point that you're trying to make in a fight needs to be relatively short. For example, if you deliver 15 minutes of stuff in a fight, basically just going on, dumping whatever you can off your chest, or just trying to process things out loud with your spouse, then it's almost a guarantee that your catcher won't hear or receive the most important and valuable things that you have to say. You see, in 15 minutes, you're likely to deliver 5 different pieces of information. Maybe everything that you have to say feels important to you. Maybe none of actually what you say pinpoints the most important thing that you have to say. But it really won't matter much because your catcher's attention is now spread across 5 different pitches, making it highly unlikely that they'll actually catch or get any of them well. And not only that, but now your catcher is more likely to feel triggered and flooded by any number of the things that you've said in that 15 minutes, and they're going to have a really hard time not feeling tempted to respond with defensiveness. Remember, your catcher has to exercise resilience in order to respond well, but you have to think realistically here as well. If they can only flex 5 minutes of resilience, as the pitcher, you need to make sure that you use that 5 minutes wisely. Otherwise, your catcher won't be catching or understanding much of anything that you have to say, which really is the point of communicating to begin with. I mean, it might feel really good to just unload everything that you're thinking and feeling, or heck, you might not even realize that you're going on for that long. But if the goal is to get understanding and resolution, then you have to be aware and intentional about being concise in your pitch. Okay, second, a good pitch needs to be precise. And when I say precise, I mean accurate and exact. And if you think about it, in order to be concise with your pitch and limited in what you say, it helps a whole lot if you're precise in what you're trying to say. Let me explain why. If you haven't really prepared and processed your pitch, the way that we talked about in Chapter 1 that covered processing and using that BTF tool, you're probably not communicating the most important and meaningful thing that you need understood. Now, if you're a verbal processor and tend to just vent or talk your frustrations out loud with your spouse, you might be expressing yourself and getting things off your chest, but you're probably not likely to get anything resolved since your spouse won't know the singular most important thing that you need from them. Think of it like throwing darts at a dartboard. You might be throwing a bunch of things out that might feel good or important to say, but if none of them are actually hitting the bullseye in terms of what the core issue really is, you're again squandering your catcher's emotional resiliency, and that conflict window that they have to listen and understand really well is likely just getting smaller and smaller. What this comes down to is that a good pitch has to be well processed and distilled before it's even delivered. I mean, think about it like this. Imagine trying to give an important presentation at work in front of 1,000 people and deciding at the last minute that you're just going to wing it and talk it out as you go. If you don't deliver your words in quick and ordered fashion without some preparation ahead of time in terms of what you want your audience to walk away with, you'll lose the attention of your audience, and your most important point will likely get lost somewhere in the midst of everything else that you have to say. A good pitch needs to be concise and precise, and in order for it to be that way, it has to be distilled and well thought out and processed ahead of time. If you go into a fight trying to figure things out as you talk about it, your fight probably isn't going to go as well as you hope. So shift your thinking on how to engage and even prepare for your conflicts. You wouldn't go up and give an important presentation in front of a bunch of people without any preparation. So give your marriage the same kind of attention to detail and prepare your thoughts and words as you would for a bunch of strangers. Okay, let's get back to the other characteristics of a good pitch. The third characteristic of a good pitch is that it needs to be introspective, meaning it needs to be focused primarily on you, not your spouse. If the focal point of your pitch is on what your spouse is doing or isn't doing, or on the kind of person that they are or what you want them to change, if you're focusing your attention on trying to get them to see what's wrong with them, then your pitch lacks introspection. It gives your spouse very little information about you and a whole lot more information about what you think of them. And because of that, you'll never really be understood because you aren't giving them anything insightful about you. It's easier to focus on what's wrong with your spouse than to focus on what you need for them to understand about you. But real resolution and even behavioral change in your spouse doesn't typically happen without them first understanding you. And they can't really understand you if you're spending most of your attention in your pitch on them. The difference is subtle, and usually it trips most couples up. But the easiest way to make sure that your pitch is introspective is to stick with that BTF form of communication. What's the behavior or trigger that your spouse did or said? Then connect that trigger with your thoughts and then your feelings. The only part of that BTF that's really focused on your spouse is that trigger, that behavior. That should only be about 10% of your focus though. The remainder of your focus needs to be on your own thoughts and feelings. And in order to derive that information for your spouse to understand, you have to be introspective and self-reflective. Okay, moving on. The fourth and last characteristic of a good pitch is that it needs to be vulnerable, meaning it has to communicate thoughts and feelings that can seem weak. Remember, a good BTF is going to communicate secondary emotions that are introspective and about you, rather than primary emotions like anger and fear. So emotions like shame, guilt, inadequacy, rejection are all good examples of secondary emotions that require vulnerability to share. These feelings take a lot of courage to share because these kinds of feelings open you up as a pitcher to being invalidated, minimized, or even ridiculed by your spouse. Or to run the risk that what you share will be weaponized and used against you later on. Or maybe even worse, that if you risk to share vulnerably about what has hurt you and the pain that you feel, that your spouse still doesn't change what they do. That might be one of the hardest and most painful things to do, to share yourself vulnerably, but then only to discover that knowing you're hurt wasn't enough for them to actually change. But even with those risks, vulnerability is an absolute necessity when pitching in conflicts that involve hurt feelings, because unless you let your guard down, you won't be emotionally available to connect and allow healing to happen. Protective walls have to come down if connection and reconciliation is going to happen. Now, keep in mind, vulnerability is not for the faint of heart. That's a really tough maneuver to make, and most couples have a hard time getting there. In a sense, you can think of these four characteristics as kind of building off of each other, or different levels of weights if you're thinking of this like building up a muscle. Vulnerability might require your muscles to lift, say, 100 pounds, but you don't have to start there, and you really probably shouldn't until you're stronger. Instead, consider it a success if you can just be more concise and precise in your pitch, something that feels a little bit more like 20 or 30 pounds. Okay, that's four characteristics of a good pitch. Remember, the point of this section of your chapter wasn't just to outline for you what a good pitch looks like, but to really impress upon you how important it is for you to always be mindful of who is pitching and who's catching in your conflicts. If there are two people trying to pitch and be understood at once without anyone catching or trying to understand, conflicts just won't end up going very well. Okay, that's it for this first section. In the next section, we'll take a look at the things that go into making for a good catch and how to respond well in conflict.